Go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Colton Fagundis. I'm a policy manager here at American Sustainable Business Council. Our webinar today is Pesticides, Cancer Prevention and Business Solutions. And let's get started. So I'm going to give a little overview of Asbc first, and then I'm going to go into who our panelists are going to be and what they're going to talk about, go over the agenda, and then we'll let our panelists speak. So the American Sustainable Business Council, we serve the business interests of over 250,000 sustainable, triple bottom line, mission-driven businesses. We're founded in 2009. We advocate for policy change, inform business owners, policymakers, and the public about the need and opportunities for building a vibrant, broadly prosperous, sustainable economy. So this webinar fits very nicely into two of our main campaigns around safer, sustainable chemicals and regenerative agriculture. So our panelists today, we're going to start with Kristen Schaefer. She's the Executive Director of the Pesticide Action Network. She's going to be giving a broad overview of the issues of pesticides, highlighting some of the health impacts, talking about specific examples of children's health and the impacts of pesticides, and also going to go into a few ways that you can get involved that Pesticide Action Network is working on. Next, Genie Economos of the Farm Workers Association of Florida. And you'll notice here that this is not a picture of Genie. Genie's philosophy is farm workers are too often silenced in our media and in our culture and in the public, and that we need to elevate them and the work that they're doing and the issues that they face. So she prefers to leave her camera off and use pictures of farm workers instead to represent herself. We were going to have a farm worker come on and speak alongside Genie. She unfortunately could not make it last minute, but Genie's going to share her story as well. Next, we're going to have Carrie Warburg Block, CEO and founder of Earthkind. Earthkind manufactures and sells alternatives to using toxic pesticides in the home. Their products are made of botanical formulations and patented delivery systems that work with nature, not against it. And these products are sourced on regenerative farms. And Carrie is going to give an overview of Earthkind, the work that they do and the alternatives that they're promoting through their business model to pesticide use, and is going to use her story as sort of a case study for how businesses can advance sustainable solutions. And so actually slides were out of order there, but our last speaker is going to be Adam Zipkin, who is counsel to US Senator Cory Booker. He will be discussing the senator's support for the Protecting America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act, and also some of the other bills that the senator is supporting that are relevant to our discussion today, namely the Climate Stewardship Act, which has become one of the senator's flagship policies and is advancing regenerative agriculture solutions to pesticide use and other environmental issues within the food and agricultural system. So before we get started, I'm actually going to read a statement from Representative Nagoose, who was not able to make it today, but was kind enough to provide us with a statement. He is the main sponsor in the House of the Protecting America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act and has been a champion for these issues. So I'm going to read this, take a couple minutes, and then we'll get started with the rest of our webinar. So hello. As a representative for Colorado's beautiful 2nd District, I'm committed to preserving our biodiversity and public health. That's why I'm proud to lead the Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act in the US House. I drew my inspiration to sponsor this bill from the city of Boulder and the countless people across that city, my district, and all of Colorado who hold grave concerns over the historic and dangerous lack of oversight on pesticides. A lack which leads to harm on the environment as well as countless negative health effects for our communities. We are fortunate to have throughout Colorado's 2nd District some of our nation's top experts in the environment's delicate and intricate systems, in organic and regenerative agriculture, and preserving and furthering healthy people and communities. For years, these experts have been warning us of the frivolous, profit-driven, and dangerous pesticide oversight system. We used this expertise last summer for the first time to reform pesticide registration regulation from an environmental perspective, a viewpoint and act delayed for far too long. As I'm sure many of you know, every year the United States uses over 1 billion pounds of pesticides, nearly 1/5 of worldwide use altogether. Once they're approved, pesticides often remain in the market for decades, even when scientific evidence overwhelmingly shows a pesticide is causing harm to people or the environment. We cannot allow the regulations put in place to protect us to fail so wholly in doing so, nor should we allow the EPA to continue putting the interests of the pesticide industry above the health and safety of people in our environment. I'm proud to have put forward legislation which bans the most harmful pesticides and sets forth regulations to ensure safe registration practices to protect the health and safety of our environment, our kids, agricultural workers, and each member of our community above the profits of the pesticide industry. And he says, thank you to each of you for your engagement on this issue. I hope that today's webinar is both informative and inspiring. So this bill that Representative Neguse is championing is a wonderful, very proactive bill, one of the most proactive bills on pesticides that's ever been introduced in the US Congress. And Adam, again, from Senator Booker's office, will be talking some more about it later. So before we get started and allow Kristen to go, I'll just let everyone know that we will have a Q&A session at the end. And if you could please use the Q&A function to put questions in, we'll address those at the end. And please try not to put your questions into the chat area. Use that Q&A box. All right, Kristen, take it away.
Thank you so much, Colton, and hello and welcome everyone. We're really excited to be here with you all for this conversation today. So as Colton mentioned, I'm going to be giving a pretty high-level overview of the pesticide problem in the United States, and then touching on why we should be concerned about that, what are some of the health and environmental harms, and a few of the solutions that we focus on at PAN, and a way folks can get involved if you'd like to. Before jumping in, I just wanted to say that PAN is, our regional center is one of 5 around the world. PAN International is a global network, and we've been working on these issues for well over 3 decades. So yeah, just to dive in, pesticide use in the US is a growing problem. There are currently more than 760 million pounds of pesticides used on US farms every year. That's insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and that's just the agricultural pesticides. So as Representative Neguse mentioned, we're over 1.2 billion pounds of pesticides overall, if you include uses in homes and parks and golf courses, playgrounds, etc. Also, there are over 17,000 pesticide products on the market. And as you see in this graph, the volume of pesticide use is increasing dramatically. So this is taken from the US Geological Survey site, and they have estimated use from 1992 through the most recent data is 2017. This chart specifically shows increase in the use of glyphosate. Next slide. So I also just wanted to give folks a little bit of a visual. This is also from the US Geological Survey site of where pesticides are heavily used. Again, these are agricultural pesticides. So you can see in the Midwest, and specifically the upper Midwest, there's heavy use there. Also California's Central Valley, you can see heavy use. This resource, the USGS site, for folks who are interested, I recommend you go and take a look. It's fascinating because, again, you can see the maps of estimated use from 1992 through 2017. So you can actually choose one chemical and see how that use has changed visually over the years. Next slide. So this is chlorpyrifos. So the previous one was glyphosate. So just again, picking a couple of pesticides that folks might be familiar with that have been in the news quite a bit lately. Next slide. So I also wanted to lift up the importance of the reforms that Representative Neguse has mentioned in and is promoting in the bill that we fully support, PACTPA, the Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticide Act. The fact is that we don't do a very good job protecting public health or the environment from pesticides in this country compared to other countries. So this is an analysis that was conducted by our colleagues at the Center for Biological Diversity a couple of years ago. And they found that of these 1.2 billion pounds of pesticides that are used in the US, using data from 2016, 322 million pounds are pesticides that have already been banned in Europe. due to the health and environmental concerns. 40 million pounds of those pesticides are no longer used in China. They've been taken off the market there. And 26 million pounds of pesticides, again, still in use in the United States, have been banned in Brazil. So for us, this again points to the urgency of the reforms that, that are laid out in this legislation that they fully support and is long overdue to strengthen our pesticide rules nationwide. Next slide. So I want to turn now just to a brief overview of why we should be concerned. So highlighting some of the health harms that have been linked to pesticide exposure. So pesticide exposure can increase the risk of neurodevelopmental harms, cancer, Parkinson's disease, birth defects, and many more. Definitely farm workers are on the front line of these exposures, and you'll hear more about that from Genie in her presentation, as well as farm families in agricultural areas, and all of us through dietary exposures as well. Next slide. And just to touch briefly, again, there's a lot of science here, and this is pretty high level, but the question of how people are exposed to pesticides. So exposure happens through drift in the air, also through water contamination and through diet. The American Academy of Pediatrics noted that for children across the country, dietary exposure is the primary route of exposure to pesticides. Communities of color are definitely disproportionately affected by pesticide exposure. Here in California, for example, the Department of Public Health several years ago did an analysis of schools in agricultural counties that were near application of agricultural pesticides, and the vast majority of those students were Latinx families. So which led, as I'll talk about soon, to the establishment of buffer zones to protect those sensitive sites. Also just wanted to note here that very low levels of pesticide exposure can be harmful, that the timing can actually be more critical than the dose of exposure. So a tiny amount of pesticide exposure prenatally or in early childhood, for example, can derail biological systems in a way that really has lifelong effects. Next slide. And here again, lifting up the fact that children are really particularly vulnerable to pesticides. So these are two reports that our scientists here at Pesticide Action Network pulled together, reviewing literally hundreds of studies, scientific studies, and pulling out where the strongest science is linking pesticide exposure to childhood health harms. The top two areas where the science is strongest is neurodevelopmental harms and certain childhood cancers. Next slide. Wanted to just shift and touch very briefly on some of the other effects of pesticides. A lot of our work here at PAN focuses on health harms and mitigating health harms of pesticides, but also we work on impacts on pollinators, very strong science linking pesticides with pollinator collapse. Also, especially in the last couple of years, there's been some very strong studies showing that agricultural pesticides are one of the primary drivers of biodiversity collapse around the world, particularly insects, but also birds, fish, and others. So this is an urgent problem. Next slide. And then also just again to touch very briefly on the problems that pesticides can cause on the farm. Widespread use of an individual pesticide like glyphosate and Roundup Ready crops, for example, produces resistance in the target pest. So we're seeing very widespread resistance, weed resistance now to glyphosate across the Midwest, which creates a pesticide treadmill where farmers are then basically forced to either start using more toxic chemicals or cocktails of chemicals or increase the volume of pesticides that they're using. So this is an ongoing, we've been seeing this again for the last several decades. This is what happens. Basically, pests develop resistance as chemicals are used, and then farmers it increases that pesticide treadmill and increases the volume of pesticides used. We also, just back the previous slide. Thanks. Just to note very briefly, we work with farmers in the Midwest that are seeing literally millions of acres of crops damaged from herbicides that are being brought in to replace glyphosate, which no longer works on weeds. So dicamba drift has been created incredible financial harm for farmers across the Midwest region. Next slide. Okay, so then just a shift to solutions, very briefly at all levels. So local policy change, here are a couple of examples, farm to school programs, pesticide-free parks and playgrounds, honeybee havens, lots of organizing going on across the country in these areas. Next slide. And state policy change is an area we focus on a lot at PAN. We work in coalition in 4 agricultural states: Iowa, Minnesota, California, and Hawaii, as well as working with other states across the country. And here are just a few examples of some of the policies that can help protect communities and shift us away from reliance on pesticides. Next slide. And then just underscoring the urgent need for change at the national level. We really need to strengthen those pesticide rules, as we saw that we are way behind in terms of what we're doing to protect public health and the environment compared to many other countries. And some of the worst pesticides really need to just be getting off the market. And we need to get serious about investing in healthier farming and providing support and incentives to farmers so they can reduce their reliance on these chemicals. Next slide. Finally, I just wanted to lift up that there's really strong science from around the world showing that we really can shift away from reliance on these chemicals, and not only will that actually increase food production in many cases, but it will also help mitigate the effects of climate change. So farming that is not chemical intensive can be part of a climate change solution. Next slide. And then finally, there are just some resources for you all, for folks who want to get more involved and engaged. I wanted to flag that the short link up at the top will take you directly to an action alert that is live now. We're collecting signatures that will be delivered to the new EPA administrator as soon as he is confirmed, that highlight asking basically for urgent action on some of the most dangerous pesticides that were green lighted, or actually expanded use was approved for these pesticides under the outgoing administration. So welcome folks to take action there and get involved. I look forward to the conversation. With that, Colton, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Kristen. So before we move on to Genie, I'm going to just make a quick note that oh, it looks like the slides are advancing automatically for me now, Genie. I don't know why they didn't before. But anyways, please, again, direct any questions that you have to the Q&A box. We'll address those at the end of the meeting. And then also, yes, we will be sending this recording as a follow-up, as well as any other materials that our panelists would like to share today. And with that, Genie, take it away. But Genie, I believe you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Colton, and thank you very much to everyone who joined the webinar today. We really appreciate your attendance at the webinar. Jessica Ramirez is an immigrant from Mexico and also the mother of 3 beautiful children. When she first came to the United States from Mexico, she landed in Central Florida and got a job in agriculture, because it was one of the few jobs that were available to immigrants in the area. In Central Florida, we have lots of ornamental plant nurseries, and Jessica began working there because she was used to working with plants. She had worked on farms in Mexico when her family was there. She began working at a nursery and was learning about the plants, and one day a friend of hers told her that if she wanted to make more money, she could learn how to mix the pesticides, because it was a higher wage rate for mixing pesticides. Well, she began doing that. Nobody properly trained her how to mix the pesticides, and no one gave her protective equipment. She was concerned about the pesticides, so she tried to protect herself by holding her shirt over her nose and her face while she was working, and trying to protect her hands as much as possible. But she had no protective equipment, so she kept working. She was also working while she was pregnant. She needed the job. She had a family to support. She had 2 other children, and so she continued working. When her beautiful daughter, Gali, was born, she was born with craniosynotosis, which is a birth defect of the head and the brain where the skull does not close properly. Her child had to have multiple operations, including wearing this helmet. It was so devastating to see this tiny infant wearing a helmet on her head, to be able to get the brain to the skull to close properly. So Jessica had to leave work for a while to take care of her child. Years later, she wondered if working with those pesticides was related to the birth defect of her daughter. Unfortunately, there's no way to absolutely prove it because farm workers are exposed to multiple pesticides in the workplace, and it's very hard to identify the birth defects with a particular pesticide. Today, Jessica works for the Farm Worker Association of Florida as an organizer, and she does pesticide trainings with farm workers of reproductive age to let them know about the risks of pesticide exposure. But this didn't need to happen. First of all, employers should provide workers with proper protective equipment and proper training. But also we need to end our dependence on these toxic pesticides, because what kind of harm are we giving to people and families? I'm showing these slides here rather than having other slides, because I think it's important to humanize farm workers and see the real people. And I prefer to call them men, women, children, and families than farm workers, because these are people with vibrant, full, rich lives that do the work that most other people will not do for very low wages and of suffering intimidation and harassment and other kinds of abuses, including sexual harassment and intimidation for immigration in the workplace. That being said, I think it's really important to have an underpinning understanding of the fact that farm workers in the United States today are living the legacy of slavery. We've been saying this for decades, but with the advent of the Black Lives Matter movement this past year, there's been more and more talk about the legacy of slavery continuing to today. And it's gratifying to hear that, because when I say that they're living the legacy of slavery, that is not just a comparison or a figure of speech, but it's absolutely real and correct, because farm workers are not covered by labor laws that protect all other workers in the United States, almost all other workers in the United States. And that affects their work in agriculture. Our entire system of agriculture is based on a cheap, exploitable labor force, and that's mostly people of color. So we're focusing on pesticides today to do the work that feeds this country. Farm workers are exposed to, as Kristen said, there's over 17,000 different kinds of pesticide products. They're not exposed to just one kind of pesticide. What that means is that farm workers are experiencing not only effects from one pesticide, but combinations of pesticides. And we continue to say that we need to address synergistic, additive, and cumulative effects of pesticide exposure. Because it's so hard toxicologically to prove a particular pesticide is causing a particular disease outcome, and these are long-term outcomes. There's acute symptoms of pesticide exposure, like headaches, nausea, dizziness, vomiting. But then there's long-term effects of pesticide exposure, including cancer, reproductive health issues, Parkinson's disease, and birth defects of children. And chlorpyrifos, which Kristen mentioned earlier, is known to cause autism, learning disabilities, ADHD in the children of farm workers. This is unconscionable that we are exposing an entire group of people who do some of the most important work in our country to chemicals that can cause these health harms. So I consider pesticides a public health issue and a health justice issue when you're referring to farm workers. I'm going to give you one other little story. We used to conduct trainings for healthcare providers in clinics, and there was a story of a young boy whose parents were farm workers, and he was sick all the time, and the doctors couldn't find out why. For years, he was sick. Finally, the doctor asked questions about the parents' occupation, and they found out that the little boy was putting on his father's work shoes after his father took his shoes off after work. Well, the shoes were leather and they had absorbed pesticides. And when the boy wore the father's shoes, he was getting a dose of pesticides through his father's work shoes. Once he stopped wearing his father's shoes, the symptoms cleared up. I'm saying these stories because I could talk about the statistics about pesticides, for a 2-hour webinar. What's important to know is the story of real people and how these pesticides are affecting the people that do the work that feeds the rest of the country. To conclude, a few things I want to say is that farm workers are just landless farmers. Think about that. A lot of farm workers would actually, if they had the opportunity and access, they could be farmers. They have knowledge, they have experience. A lot of them bring indigenous knowledge from their home countries in Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Mexico, Haiti, and including African Americans that descended from slaves. They have lots of knowledge, but they don't have access to land. So I say that because in terms of solutions, one of the things that the Farm Worker Association is doing and subscribes to is food sovereignty and agroecology. And food sovereignty is not food security. It's beyond food security. Food security just means that people get food. Food sovereignty gives people control over their own food system. And with the large corporate farms continuing to grow, not just in this country, but in other countries, people are losing their food sovereignty. So communities need to take back their power and have control over their own food system, which means that they can implement permaculture, IPM, and agroecological principles. And one of the things that our organization does is allows farm workers to exchange their indigenous knowledge. Mexican methods of agriculture sharing with Hondurans and Haitians to implement all these different kinds of techniques to try and begin from the grassroots up to convert our entire agricultural system. We might be small, but we're part of a network nationwide, and we're also part of La Via Campesina, which is an international movement that also subscribes to agroecological principles and food sovereignty. So again, I could talk a lot more, but I hope you will look at the faces of these farm workers and wonder where they are today and what they're doing today. And maybe at the end of this, and next time you eat, you can just give some thanks to the hands that harvested the food that you pick, and think about the importance of all of us getting involved in reducing the pesticide registration, the pesticide use in this country to protect ourselves, our environment, but to protect the first line essential workers that are in the fields harvesting our food and help us have better health care, public health and health justice in our country. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie. That was powerful. Thank you. And so that's a great segue as Genie is starting to discuss some of the solutions that the Farm Workers Association of Florida and the farm workers have been working on to pesticide issues. Now we're going to turn it over to Carrie, who is going to discuss some of the business solutions to pesticide use that she has been advancing.
Thank you so much, Colton. And thank you, Janine. I was a farm worker myself. Our family farmed in Western North Dakota. We had 1,100 acres, mostly small grains. I also had a 2-acre truck garden. My farmer husband was accidentally exposed to to Roundup. bad accident. He almost died. His mother died from being exposed. My father was an entomologist, and he did studies and trials to bring out new products. He also worked with agrochemicals. He died from cancer as well. So we were a little touchy on the subject. We were starting to get into organic practices, doing everything we could. I also saw up close and personal what happened when, say, the subsidies went away for bees and our pollinators went away. We all started planting milkweed. We did a lot to protect the health of the ecosystem, to grow those crops and pollinate them. I had a terrible problem on the farm. We had rodents getting into our tractors and trucks and combines, and they'd chew on the wiring, they'd chew on the seats. It was a pretty common problem in farm country all over the US. I didn't know it. I thought it was just me. I started reaching out to companies that were out there and said, there's got to be something we can use that's not a bait or trap. I didn't want to use something inhumane, and I certainly didn't want to use something with a hazardous chemical around my children and around the wildlife. So I started doing some research, and after making these calls, I called every company out there. They pretty much said, you're stupid, it doesn't matter, you know, accept it, this is the only option. I said, but I have kids, you know, what about my pets? What about the wildlife? And so it became real apparent to me that a better solution needed to be invented if there was any hope of any chance of change. So I set about doing that, invented the first botanical rodent repellent to get federal EPA registered, and learned how to, I commercialized that product, brought it out across the country. It's in about 35,000 stores now. But I met up with a lot of resistance originally because this is not something that had been done. But it was really important to me that people wouldn't see this as a snake oil thing, that really there was true science behind this, which there was, but really no infrastructure currently existed. We had to bring our product in through the traditional FIFRA, all the toxic tests looking for dead bodies. Wait, there's no dead bodies. This is a preventive type solution. So I created a gathering, so to speak, of I worked with the university. I worked with USDA. I worked with SBA. I worked with counties, anybody that I could to help me understand and figure out how to move this thing forward. Ultimately, we got the product registered and we got it out in the market. And 7 years later, 8 of the most toxic rodenticides were removed from market. And I'm real happy about that. It was a very difficult thing because I had to sell everything I owned, and it was extremely difficult to do with the existing infrastructure and the pressures out there. Back then, there was 12,000 children being admitted to emergency just on the rodent poisons, accidentally ingesting them. There was like 6,000 to 7,000 dogs each year. Sadly, even after these changes have been made and the most toxic products are gone, there still is a lot of problem happening. And so there certainly needs to be policy changes. I see the states and the federal greatly understaffed with the work they need to do. And there needs to be a lot done here. And I think there's a lot that we can do. And thank you. I'll take questions afterwards.
So I'm going to pass it over now to Adam. Thank you so much, Carrie. And Adam, please take it away and keep going if my internet cuts out, but I think Kathleen's going to MC from now on. All right.
Thank you so much, Colton. And it has been very sort of informative to just sit and metabolize the presentations by the first three speakers. And I think it really will inform the two bills that I'm going to talk about. And the first one, which you read Congressman Negus's statement, and the Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act, which Senator Booker was a co-sponsor in the Senate last Congress and intends to be a co-sponsor again in the new Congress, and really try to champion this. And this bill really is the gold standard, right? Because this bill would ban some of the most damaging pesticides, which, as we heard, other countries already ban. And, you know, these pesticides that are harming our farm workers, but to use the better terminology, these men and women and children and families, and just the litany of harms that we heard, from birth defects to autism rates to Parkinson's disease. And so the last half hour has really made the case for why we need to have these toxic chemicals just completely banned. And that will be something that Senator Booker is fighting for this year, next year. And you know, as was stated, it's a health justice issue. It's an environmental justice issue. And as we know, you know, the moral arc of the universe may bend towards justice, but it doesn't always happen quickly, and it doesn't happen without just a lot of perseverance by advocates and by members of Congress. And so we're just going to have to keep pushing until there's a ban, until these chemicals are banned. And, you know, at this moment, looking at the congressional landscape and the fact that that type of ban would need 60 votes in the Senate, until we start to build some bipartisan support to do this, it's not going to happen in the near term. I think there are steps that the administration can take on some of these issues using their authority, and Congress can help push them towards doing that. But I think that this bill, it really can't be overstated, the need for it and the importance of it. The second bill that I want to talk about, that has a potentially more near-term path to, in whole or in part, being enacted into law, is the Climate Stewardship Act. And so the Climate Stewardship Act is a bill that Senator Booker introduced last Congress and plans to reintroduce this year, that is focused on what are called natural climate solutions. So currently in the US, our forests, our wetlands, our soils absorb something like 11% of all carbon emissions in the US. Scientists are telling us if we invest in those carbon sinks, that they could absorb a lot more. And so the bill would plant billions of trees, restore millions of acres of coastal wetlands. But really the heart of the bill, and relevant for this conversation, is that the bill would invest billions of dollars a year of new funding into existing voluntary USDA conservation programs, that but not just putting the money into the programs writ large, but focused on a subset of 30 or 35 practices that scientists have told us would increase soil health and increase carbon sequestration in the soil. Now, why is all that relevant to this webinar and to the need to decrease the use of pesticides? And what we know is that improved soil health leads to reduced need for pesticides, both in general and as a result of specific practices which promote soil health. Soil health practices such as crop rotation lead to an increase in biodiversity, which is correlated in scientific, studies with a decrease in pest activity, and therefore a decreased need for the use of pesticides. And to state it another way, pesticides degrade soil health, creating a vicious cycle of a need for more pesticides ever more each year versus the conservation practices that we would be investing heavily in trying to get, hundreds of millions of acres to adopt these types of conservation practices. They build soil health and they inherently lead to less use of pesticides. And so what type of practices am I talking about? Crop rotations, planting cover crops, using filter strips, nutrient management, prescribed grazing or rotational grazing, no-till farming, planting riparian forest buffers or silvopasture. These are the types of practices. And when we worked on this bill last year and introduced it, we had a coalition of support, not just from some environmental groups and public health focus groups and others that you might expect to be supporting a bill like this, but also progressive family farm and rancher groups and advocates and farmers. And let me give you some examples of why. So a part of USDA called the Natural Resource Conservation Service has a whole bunch of case studies that they've done looking at farms around the country that implemented these types of practices and what were the benefits of doing that, including sort of reduced use of herbicides and pesticides. And so I'm just going to go through a few examples to try to hammer home this point. One of the case studies was a farm in New York. It's a beef and crop farm, and they implemented no-till and they planted cover crops and they used nutrient management. And ultimately, because of the doing one less sprayer trip of pesticides, they reduced their cost per acre on 122 acres of their farm by $12 an acre, right? That's one example. A farm in Illinois that grows corn and soybeans that used cover crops and nutrient management, and they achieved a 123% return on investment for the practices that they employed, and they saved ultimately $15 an acre over 800 acres of their farm. A farm in Ohio that grows corn and soybeans that did cover cropping and no-till and something called variable rate fertilizer application